Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata. First, you're watching Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. In the recent past, we've seen that India's ties with Israel have been on an upward trajectory, and that with Iran have been heading in the opposite direction. One of the major reasons for that has been the US's policies towards Iran under the Trump administration. Despite pressure from America, India has maintained its ties with Tehran. However, it may not be able to do so for too long. A recent media report has blamed Iran for carrying out a blast outside the Israeli embassy in New Delhi in January, a claim that Iran has vehemently denied. Israel and Iran have been at loggerheads for a while now, and India has been carrying out a fine balancing act. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the three I's, which is India and Israel and Iran as well, and sort out what India's options can possibly be going forward. Joining me on the program today are Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, retired diplomat, Major General Dhruv C. Katoch, retired Director, India Foundation, and Dr. Amalendu Mishra, Department of Politics, Lancaster University. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this program. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. How would you look back at the relationship between India, Iran, and Israel, how things have turned, how things have changed in the recent past?
Well, as you know that, you mentioned about three I's. The Israelis prefer to call it I for I, India for Israel or Israel for India. So that's how they look at the relationship between India and Israel. That has really gone on from strength to strength, and more so under the premiership of Prime Minister Modi, that this relationship has moved to really a truly strategic level. Of course, as you know, at the popular level, there is a great respect for the Israelis in India. And I was actually involved in this at the time when we established diplomatic relations with Israel in 1992. And since then, we have moved forward and we have taken, as you said, fine balancing of the Arab world as well, because the Palestine was a major issue and not necessarily the Iran as far as India is concerned. So we continue to develop our relationship mostly in agriculture, technologies, defense and security. That's where Israel is very important and continues to support India. And even during the recent fracas with China and Pakistan, Israel had stood by India. So there is definitely a very strong relationship. As far as the relationship with Iran is concerned, it's historic, civilizational, and we have continued to grow. We were dependent on them for oil and gas to a substantial about 11 to 12% of our oil we were getting from there. However, under President Trump and under the various sanctions, even though earlier days India was able to get some waivers, but when President Trump tried to use his maximum pressure policy and he threatened India and other countries who were getting it to reduce supplies from there. So that actually happened, even though we know that Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister, visited India. President Rouhani had come to India. Prime Minister Modi had gone there. We had a trilateral agreement which was signed with Afghanistan. And so from our point of view, the Chabahar is extremely important, and so is the relationship with Iran. Iran understands it very well, that India's compulsions, even though it would prefer India to take a more strong stance, but then every country has to look after its own national interest first. The bilateral relationships have to serve that national interest, and that's what precisely, in my view, India has done. So we have nearly reduced our imports from Iran to nearly zero, and that is a negative in the relationship. In the meantime, China has expanded its footprint in Iran to a great extent, has continued to support them. So it's a question of a geopolitics. Secondly, the countries from the Arab world, whether it is UAE or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or others, they have been trying to fill the gap. So are the Americans and Russians to our shortage. Fortunately for us, in this respect, I would say the COVID has reduced our demand for the hydrocarbons in the meantime. So therefore, there's substantial decrease in that. So that has not really impacted our economy to that extent. But India is trying very hard. We know that the visit of Raksha Mantri and the Videsh Mantri, the external affairs ministers, both via Moscow. They went and met their counterparts in Iran. We recently, only last week at the Maritime International Summit, had the Chabahar Day, which we celebrated. We are picking up the threads from there because Iran is also, and Chabahar per se, is extremely important for our outreach to Afghanistan and to Central Asia, as well as we are trying to push for India becoming, Iran, Chabahar becoming an north-south transport corridor port. So we are working together with all the partners, and I don't say, of course, relationship in one sense is not moving the way it should have, but then this is the global geopolitics that dictates at the end of the day we have to look after our own interest, and the Iranians understand that, and so do the Israelis.
Absolutely. And General, since we are here and since India has done a fine job over the years, like the ambassador has just pointed out, to striking a fine balancing act, not just with these two countries that we're talking about, but several others as well. So, yes, Israel is very important to India and so is Iran. So, how do we, progress and go forward?
I think one of the things which has happened in Indian foreign policy since 2014 onwards, that was the time when the Narendra Modi government came into power for the first time, is there were dramatic developments, especially in the field of foreign affairs. And one of the things which took place was India stopped hyphenating its relationship with countries. And that happened across the board. Of course, there was also the neighborhood first policies, etc., which came up and which has done a great deal of good as far as India is globally. Now, the question is, what do we do? There is certainly a great degree of tension between Israel and Iran, and so far, I think we have tread that path very, very well. That we have maintained strong relationship with Israel. We have also maintained good relationship with Iran, despite the fact that the oil which we were importing for them trickled down to zero. And basically, there was no way we could import oil because the payment has to be done in dollar terms, and those banks are controlled by the US. So it was a no-go area. Now, had India something substantive to export to Iran of an equal value, perhaps we could have taken that oil, but that, of course, was not the case. So I presume we had to live with the situation. Now, going forward, I think India is uniquely placed actually because we are, in a sense, a very trustworthy ally across the globe to all parties, even those parties which are opposed to each other. So, here, when we see a very distrustful relationship existing between Israel and Iran, India can play, in my view, the honest broker. And while it may not lead to a rapprochement between the two, at least I think we can ease tensions. Basically, Frank, in my view, what is the critical problem is really not the US, it is the Iranian nuclear program of which the Israelis are scared. And they feel that this nuclear program has the potential to destroy Israel. So that is actually the crux of the entire problem. And if somehow we can resolve that security issue of Israel, I think we can proceed towards a rapprochement between these two countries. Frank.
Absolutely. All right. So, Amlind Mishra, let me bring you into the picture now. Let's talk about the US a little bit. Of course, under the Trump administration, we saw the relationship between Iran and the United States go down south. But things seem to be changing now that we have Biden at the helm in Washington, D.C. Does that also mean that it can lead to an improvement of ties between Iran and its other partners or allies?
I think definitely there is a positive signal there, as both of our colleagues have already highlighted. Our relationship has always been hostage to whatever has been going on outside. The reason why Indo-Iranian relationship nosedived was because of the steps taken by President Trump's administration that is changing, as you rightly pointed out. And indications are that the Joe Biden administration is going to be much more proactive and is not going to engage with Iran in military terms. So there is a certain degree of rapprochement that we have seen, especially in the last couple of months. Yes, Iran hasn't sort of embraced it fully, the kind of positive notes that are being sent from White House. But I think that is going to change. So it is not only in the interest of the Americans alone, but it's also in the interest of the Europeans too. Europeans would like to have Iran back in Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that General was talking about earlier. So what we are going to witness is a change of tune in Washington, Tehran, Brussels, and that is going to have an effect in New Delhi. So although we have lost Iran for the time being, once Biden administration opens up the possibilities in terms of engagement, in terms of what you may call lifting of restrictions, sanctions, and so on and so forth. Something else that we have to take into account in this specific area, and that is the relationship between Tel Aviv and Washington. So what we have seen is that the relationship between Tehran and Washington has always been subject to the kind of relationship that Israel has with the United States. And we saw there was a low point in Israeli US relationship when President Barack Obama was in power. He was somewhat, I won't say pro Iranian, but he could see through the challenges and he was prepared to accommodate Iran. And that is the reason why we had the nuclear deal, which obviously was undermined by Trump administration. So what we have here is the same vice president who was working under Obama administration is now in charge. And he sort of makes no bones about it when it comes to his views towards Israel. So the kind of cooling of relationship between Iran and Washington is going to take place because Biden administration is going to not so proactive in its linkages with Israel. That is the indication, early indication. So if that happens, then Iran is going to come back into the US orbit, and that would sort of lead to positive outcomes all around. That is what we should hope for at the moment. But as we all know, this is a kind of complex game, and there is something one is going to gain out of it, and others are going to lose. So it's only time which is going to tell us as to who are the ones who are going to come out successful.
Absolutely. Indications have been made by the Biden administration. An olive branch has been extended really towards Iran, but Iran seems to be playing hardball for the moment. General, I'm going to take that up with you in just a bit. But before that, Ambassador, let me come back to a point that the General was making earlier in the program about how India, can play the role of an honest broker and how India has cordial and friendly ties with both Iran and Israel. So can we in the near future, maybe try and see some kind of a role of an honest broker?
Well, this is absolutely, I agree with General that, and I have always maintained that India needs to step up its profile and must be able to take some additional steps in order to reach out to various countries. I mean, Palestinians expect us to take some forward role vis-a-vis Israelis. We have refrained from doing that except in bilateral, just mentioning something. We have Syrians want us to come in and try and help them. The Iranians, of course, have not asked us that we should talk to Israel, but they know that we have excellent relations and they don't grudge it that much, in my view.
Ambassador, if I may, what's holding us back really? Why don't we just go ahead and do it?
Well,
because there is a lot of goodwill to be gained.
No, there is a goodwill to be gained, but this is also a place where a lot of countries have burned their bridges. And I don't think anybody has been successful, all the major powers, and that's the reason, but they can afford to have it. So in India, we have had a little bit of a conservative policy in this regard that we maintain bilateral relations. We have dehyphenated Palestine-Israel issue or the Saudi or Iranian issue that way. So we have excellent bilateral relations with nearly every country. But then we are traveling in all the boats. So that sometimes does not yield you the same kind of traction that you will need in the region. So that is precisely the reason. Secondly, we are the only country which has more than 9 million people in the region. So it is extremely important from our point of view that if you rub, and this is a very complicated politics in the region among these countries. It is not simply Shia Sunni or it is not simply geopolitical influence. It is actually today, if you come to think of it, due to the low oil prices and the problems that are happening in the region, Arab Spring and all that, what we are witnessing is the non-Arab countries are actually ruling the roost in the region, whether it is Iran, Turkey, or for that matter, Israel, not the Saudis or the UAE or others who are doing that. And that's where the Arab Spring has come about. So we are actually today what we are seeing is, and I think India must take great note of it. I am visualizing a different kind of a power equation emerging there, unless, of course, Biden brings Tehran back to the JCPOA table and they sign and they try to assuage their concerns. We are looking at some kind of a dynamic that is like China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Qatar on the outlier. Qatar is an outlier, and Pakistan, they're very much. So this is which I call cryptic. This is what is emerging. On the other hand, you have these Arab Abraham Accord countries with led by Israel. In fact, Israel has also offered to create a kind of a defense alliance with Saudi Arabia and UAE and some other countries in the region, especially the Sunni countries, Bahrain and all. So this is what. So this will bring about exactly two blocks rather than in the region. And now with Quad and all that coming, I think that there is going to be a little more accentuation. As you know, only 2 days ago, Lavrov was in both UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And he met the Turkish foreign minister there and they issued a statement. So there is so much happening right now in that sense. And I think that we have very well saved our interest so far. But if the situation becomes that way, we'll have to be. At the moment, in my view, we have much closer dependencies on the countries of the Abraham Accords. So therefore, I think that our vote is there at the moment. On the other side is, of course, how China behaves eventually, and it is already very well embedded from Bahrain to Israel all the way. And they are doing everything that they can. And I think that is something we need to be very careful about.
Absolutely. All right, General. Let's talk about the JCPOA and how there have been certain overtures that have been made by the Biden administration, but Iran seems to be playing hardball at the moment. We don't know what Rouhani's future is going to be like as well. So these are some aspects that we need to consider, that we need to focus on as far as the Iranian issue is concerned.
I think a point as far as the JCPOA is concerned, which is being missed out, is today Iranian public opinion. And that has shifted very significantly towards going nuclear. It was not there earlier, but now I think with the tension which has been brewing in the region, the Iranian public opinion now is firmly behind their nuclear stand. And that is what has led to a hardening of the stand as far as the Iranian leadership is concerned, because the public is now supporting them. So where do we move from here? I think ultimately all that Israel requires is some form of concrete assurance that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, it will not be used against Israel. Now, there was a conversation which I had with certain leaders, with certain diplomats, I think a few years back, and they made it very clear, this is from the Israeli side, that should they get an inkling of a development of a nuclear weapon by Iran, then they will take action proactively. They were very clear about it. And for them, it is an existential crisis. So I think if Iran has to be very aware of Israeli sensitivities, because Israel will go to war if Iran produces the nuclear bomb. So those are where the lines are drawn. So what role does India play? Now, I think it is high time India actually, we cannot keep sitting on the fence. I think we will have to get proactive on this particular issue, because our interests are very firmly tied up in what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. If perchance, due to some black swan event, the Strait of Hormuz closes down for whatever reasons, what happens to our oil imports? Those are the things which I think are of very great concern to us. So our diplomacy, our political establishment has to do that extra outreach. I know it is a very, very difficult tightrope walk, but I think that the need of the hour or the present day times demands it. And we have a political leadership which can deliver, and we have perhaps one of the best diplomats across the world. So it is achievable. Difficult, yes. Achievable, yes.
Absolutely. Right. And Amalindu, how is the tension between Iran and Israel really impacting the region? And also, does it have an impact on India's ties with these two countries?
Well, the set of things that are happening in the Middle Eastern region is clearly divided. We have a binary now, and that is that one camp which is being led by Israel, and the Arab states are falling into its orbit. Mr. Ambassador also talked about the Abraham Accord, which facilitated towards the establishment of diplomatic relationship with UAE, Morocco, then we had Bahrain as well, and Sudan. So what we are going to witness in the foreseeable future is the Middle Eastern region being divided into two camps. One is the Sunni camp led by Saudi Arabia, supported by Israel, and the other one is the Shia camp led by Iran and its allies in terms of Hezbollah or whatever going on in Syria. So Iran is unlikely to get rid of its national plan, and that is the destruction of the state of Israel, quote unquote. And as Mr. General has already pointed out, Israel is not going to take it sitting down. So it also has a game plan. So just like the way we have this divide on the subcontinent in terms of nuclearization of Pakistan and India, we are going to witness that openly in the Middle East. There is no scaling back from it. So the scene is already set. And however hard we try to say that there is options for peace, that things are going to fall into place, that is not going to happen. That is never going to happen. So Saudis are rattled. So are the UAE contingent, as well as the larger Middle East. And given the fact that the Sunni-led Arab states have decided to forego their sort of pushing forward of the Palestinian cause, they're prepared to embrace Israel wholeheartedly. So it's just a matter of time when they all come into its orbit and Iran stands isolated. And that is when it is going to take a very proactive stand in terms of who its friends are and who its enemies are. So I don't think India can sort of ride two horses and say that we want to be friends with both Israel and Iran at the same time. That is not doable. What we have to have is the policy of permanent interest. We simply can't talk about having permanent friends because of civilizational ties and whatsoever. So we have to choose which are which of these two actors are the better for India in the long run. Can we do that with Iran or can we do that with Israel? So it is down to the policymakers to work it out. And the indication so far has been that Iran is not going to come into India's orbit that easily. It has sort of already started discussions with Taliban in terms of the future Afghan peace process. And if that happens, India loses its foothold in Afghanistan. Second, it has already signed an agreement with China for $400 billion. India doesn't have the deep pockets that China has. So Iran is going to go where it sort of finds the maximum outcome in terms of its national interest. So it is prepared to abandon India whenever there is a requirement, there is a need. And if you talk about, I want to bring in something here, the bombing that you referred to at the very beginning outside the Israel embassy. So that is a message that we don't care. If actually Al-Quds is involved in it, we don't know it's early days what the reports are going to be. So they're basically sending a message that we are going to go that extra mile if it undermines our interest. So that is a very problematic scenario which Indian policymakers, especially the ones who are in charge, need to think about.
Absolutely. I think, since we are here, then on that note, we'll get closing comments on the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, I think that we really do not have the leverage where we can choose between either Israel or Iran. Iran is extremely important from your connectivity perspective through Afghanistan and to Central Asia. And therefore, we need to continue to work with them. They want to work with us, but then we know how to deal with them. For Israel, as far as even though it has got friendships with some Arab countries now and continue to expand its area of influence, it will all depend exactly, in my view, how the US plays out its cards vis-a-vis Iran. Israeli security is paramount for the Americans in the Middle East. And today what we are seeing is a retracting America, for last many years from the region as it is, even though they're trying to come back in some way in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, for India, we will have to continue to bet on these for the time being and try to create a situation where that we can have some kind of a presence whenever the negotiations of some sort happen. The Iranians also cannot continue to go on for we must not forget before 1979 Israel and Iranians were on the same side and the first nuclear reactors were provided by the Israelis, all technologies or the latest equipment by the Israelis to the Iranians. So there is no definitive thing. And as Professor rightly mentioned, your interests are permanent. So if our interest is definitely in oil and definitely in the Iranian assets and through the connectivity, I think we cannot dump it in any way. And this is the science at the moment from the government is very clear. So that they are going ahead with Iran and Israel understands that. And of course, our relationship with Israel remains at a very high pedestal.
Absolutely. General?
Frank, I think in my view, we are treading a difficult path, but that is the way international relations are. So it can never be for India my way or the highway. We will deal with both the warring parties, and the beauty of the system is that both these parties, they trust us. So because they trust us, we are in an ideal situation. I'm not saying that we can play the role of a person who can mediate and actually resolve the issue. That is going to take a huge amount of time. But at least we can get to a situation or get both the parties to a situation by which there will be no war. And if we can ensure that there is no conflict per se in the Gulf region, I think we have preserved our national interest, because our national interest lies in keeping those sea lanes open across the Strait of Hormuz and the oil supply coming in. Now, all that we need to do is to ensure there is no war. And if we can do that, we have maintained our interests. Frank.
Absolutely. And Amalinder Mishra, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I mean, there are some positive indications. I mean, you mentioned about Quad the other day, which sort of displayed the bonhomie that we have between Washington and New Delhi. So perhaps New Delhi can use that particular opportunity to make space for United States so far as Iran is concerned, and at the same time, uh, address the kind of drawbacks that we have had with Iran all these years. So there is a wind of change coming from Biden administration, and that is definitely going to soften US stand towards Iran. And India, if it positions itself cleverly, can take advantage of it and open up all those possibilities that were undermined during Trump administration. So we have to tread very carefully. It's early days, but I wouldn't sort of give up, especially since we have so much at stake, especially in terms of our linkages to Afghanistan, Central Asia, the corridor. Yes, we don't have the deep pockets as China does, but at the same time, we have the soft power. That is to our advantage. No one distrusts the same way China is distrusted. So I think if we can push that narrative forward, then it will be a very good outcome indeed.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of Big Picture with Frank Rausan Pereira. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that Iran and Israel are trusted friends, and we can't do without both of them. New Delhi has to continue doing a tightrope walk between the two. The situation in West Asia is moving in a direction where we may have to be forced to take sides sooner or later, but that is not an option for us. We have to do a fine balancing act like we've done in the past going forward as well. We just don't have the leverage to choose between Israel and Iran. We can't dump either country, and both nations understand that. We have to use our goodwill and diplomacy to handle the emerging situation with care. Well, before I sign off, let me also thank you once again for being here. Remember to like and subscribe to Bharata First on YouTube. Also follow the social media handles. I need your support now more so than ever. Please spread the word. That's it from me. See you again next time.